I think there is a much more serious issue domestically within China, which is why for him to skip two summits back to back is not
Hmm.
normal. And the G20, of course, uh, for China today is much more significant than it was 10 years ago because of the sheer place of China in the global economic landscape. Similarly, Jakarta is their backyard, and it is, and of course, the fact is that, President Biden is also not going to Jakarta. So I would say that the bilateral explanation could only be a part of it as far as New Delhi is concerned. But we must also not lose sight of what could be the other factors, and this includes internal challenges, problems within China.
Welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadhar. Good evening. India's moment in the sun later this week, in fact, this weekend, when the G20 summit takes place. Not very clear whether it's really a moment in the sun, given that President Putin will not be there, China's President Xi Jinping will not be there. There would be others, of course, Biden and Trudeau and Rishi Sunak and others. But is that enough? And there are also doubts about an outcomes document. Will there be consensus on some of the major issues of the day, including, of course, Ukraine? I'd like to bring in my guest at this point, Ambassador Pankaj Saran, former Deputy National Security Advisor. He's also convener of the Natstrat think tank. Sir, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much, Surya. Delighted to be back with you.
So let's begin with the Xi and Putin not turning up for the summit. Does that take away from the summit? Does that reflect our own lack of influence or clout in these capitals?
Thank you. Thank you, Surya. Well, I mean, to begin with, I can sense the air in Delhi and the excitement definitely is growing. And you can make out that every single agency is involved in putting up the best foot forward to have a grand summit. And I think it will be a very grand summit. I think it's definitely a moment in the sun for India. We never imagined when this was started in 2008, there would come a time when India would be hosting the G20. It just seemed so far away from us. So I would say definitely it is a big achievement for us. The Russia-China thing has always been at the background ever since the start of the Ukraine conflict last February. And this has been true for every single meeting, working group, I mean, right through every stage of the build-up to the G20 process. The point I think we have to maybe understand is that the behavior of Russia and China actually does not have as much to do with their bilateral relations with India. I'll come to China in a bit.
Yeah.
But more with the dynamic playing out between them and the G7. So while till now, till Ukraine, we were able to approach the G20 as a collective body, papering over political and strategic contestations and differences and focusing on the subject at hand, which was finance, trade, development, climate. These were the real issues for G20. We were okay. But obviously, February last year has changed everything. So the Russia explanation lies there about the fact that the political fallout of the conflict is now playing into the G20, and there is nothing you can do about it. It is something that is between the parties which are directly involved in the conflict. Insofar as China is concerned, definitely there is a bilateral overhang in Chinese approach to the Indian presidency as against, say, their approach to the Indonesian presidency, or perhaps what their approach will be next year towards the Brazilian presidency. Because under Lula, actually, the China-Brazil relationship has improved dramatically. So, yes, that I think we have to acknowledge. But I don't think the heavens are falling if China is not represented by its president. as far as Russia is concerned, I had always maintained that it is unlikely he will come for various reasons. But in this case, I thought he would, although I now recollect they were quite unhappy with the fact that we had decided to make our SCO summit a virtual summit rather than a in-person physical summit. But please remember that he is also not going to Jakarta for the East Asia and the ASEAN summits. So we have to actually pause a little bit and ask objectively what could be the possible factors in his decision to neither attend the Jakarta summit nor the New Delhi summit. I think it is a much more serious issue than simply bracketing it as a part of an India-China contestation.
So, Steve, while not coming to Delhi is a bilateral thing, not going for the East Asia summit, does that reflect on the fact that their relations in that region are also in a churn? A lot of face-offs happening at sea.
Not at all. I think that, look, I haven't followed it very closely, but I think there is a much more serious issue domestically within China, which is why he, for him to skip 2 summits back to back is not normal. And the G20, of course, for China today is much more significant than it was 10 years ago because of the sheer place of China in the global economic landscape. Similarly, Jakarta is their backyard. And it is, and of course, the fact is that, President Biden is also not going to Jakarta. So I would say that the bilateral explanation could only be a part of it as far as New Delhi is concerned. But we must also not lose sight of what could be the other factors. And this includes internal challenges, problems within China, which are kind of maybe forcing him not to leave the country. The bilateral, yes, I mean, I think we probably had given enough signals to China that obviously we would welcome him here. But I would not, stretch this point beyond a certain thing. Obviously, look, everyone knows that there are tensions in the relationship. These tensions, we are trying to reduce them, but they are not going away as fast as China would like, actually, not us. Because I keep saying that the onus for the repair and the restoration of the relationship that we had lies completely on China. If the 2020 events were in the reverse direction and India had taken actions and amassed 100,000 troops, I could imagine China being aggrieved. But we must not forget history and the record. And it is for China to restore that confidence in us that actually 2020 was a strategic blunder for them. And it is up to them to now make amends so that we can go back on track. We are ready. But to say that let's keep all that aside and move forward, pretending as if 2020 never happened, is actually not going down well with the Indian, let's say, with the nation as a whole, not just government, but everyone else. But I would say, but more important, than who's coming and Russia, China, of course, we have this, as I said, in the build-up, we knew that there was a Russia, China, like a G2 working at every working group, at every meeting, at every negotiation. And they were coming together, driven by different impulses. And you had the G18, so to say. Now, whether this becomes the norm for the future G20 workings, not just summits, but, the grouping as a whole, because, it's not something which happens once a year. The G20 is a standing body or a standing group, which is supposed to address, it's a self-selected group. So the question is, and I frankly do not see China delinking itself from the G20 in the sense that I have mentioned, in the sense that, forget the summitry part, but in terms of the substance and the agenda and the working and the responsibilities of the G20. So they cannot afford to delink because they are too big for the global economy to delink, and they have huge stakes. So that's the way I think we should see it. I think what is more important today for me is that the Indian approach to the G20 has changed hugely from 2008, which is where I compare it. I mean, I just happened to be there at the first G20 summit, and I was witness to what went into the creation of the G20 and the mood in the G20 at that time. India was nowhere in the picture. India was just seen as a potentially significant economy of the future. I think today the future is upon us. And the Indian narrative and the Indian self-perception of itself, that it has today emerged as a significant player to affect and influence and determine the agenda that is before the G20 is, I think, the biggest change. Today, the manner, the kind of things we are saying, the kind of approaches we are taking, the kind of positions and the platforms and groupings we are in, it's a different India. And that for me is the big change. Some people may loosely say, and of course I do not agree, but from a loose point of view, that today India is the new China when it comes to the global economy. China was the savior of the global economy in 2008.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we are the savior today, certainly far from it. But we are definitely more systemically significant to the global economy, to the climate agenda, everything, than we were 10 or 15 years ago.
Just a final point on China. Would you say the gap between India and China on some of the major issues at the G20 is substantial, or it's actually very, very close?
Ironically, I think it's very close, because I think on most issues, we are almost on the same page. The only point or the place which I don't know exactly what is the degree of difference is on the whole question of international debt. Because, the Chinese are obviously very conscious of the fact that the PRI has led to massive international indebtedness among the poorest of the poor. India, on the other hand, is being very aggressive about this point, that actually Chinese initiatives have created this kind of indebtedness, which in the past, Western multilateral development banks and Western aid policies used to create. So that is one thing. But on the others, there is a lot of similarity in approaches. The only thing is that at a level of semantics and, at a slightly lower level in the whole hierarchy of issues, there is obviously some jostling going on about the use of certain phrases, certain words, certain ideas. And there is this thing which obviously seems to be in play, that we will not allow certain Chinese formulations to show up in international documents. And so the Chinese are realizing that they seem to feel that India is desperate enough to have some of its own formulations and ideology and phrases in this particular document, and therefore they are blocking that. So that, of course, is there. But in the bigger scheme of things, what is important is, do we agree on which way the global economy is going? Do we agree on how to solve the primary challenges of our times? I mean, do we agree, for example, on even climate issues? I mean, there again, actually, at one level, you could argue that there are fundamental differences, because China is the second largest or the largest emitter in the world. But we are not. In per capita terms, we are completely different from China. So there is only that much you can align your positions in terms of solutions to China. Similarly, on trade, I know that we have so many bilateral trade disputes with China in the WTO. The question is, or on supply chains, or even on things like, but there are some issues which, we seem to have some commonality, which is, do not weaponize international trade institutions or trade flows or capital flows, which, of course, have been the direct consequence of Ukraine. So I think India is looking to break free from the shackles of whatever constraints exist towards a growth path of, say, between 7 to 10%. And we want the right conditions to be created for that. Secondly, we want manufacturing and supply chains to be democratized. That, in the sense, we no longer are comfortable with a single country domination of global manufacturing. So we want to pull companies and big manufacturing processes into India, not necessarily from China, but of course, including from China, but on its own merits. We want to, so there is that element of an Indian resurgence, which I think will rub against the comfortable position which China had found itself in the last 10 years. I'm sorry, it's a very long reply.
Yeah, interesting. So let's moving forward, the consensus document. Do you really see leaders like President Biden, for instance, who have invested heavily in India, in Prime Minister Modi? Do you really see them blocking consensus document, or perhaps leading to a situation where there is no consensus, an outcomes document escapes the entire summit?
If they agree on a Ukraine paragraph, it'll probably be for the sake of India, not for the sake of Russia.
Okay.
To prevent embarrassment to India, and to, because of their good relations with India and the good relations today India has with the G7 and the United States. So if the G7 wants to hand over a successful summit, if they do, then it is possible, and only for perhaps that reason, they may back off and agree on some consensus on Ukraine. But if there is a consensus, it is not going to be for the love of Russia. That is quite clear. So that's a good question. Secondly, on the other things which are probably blocking, I think one of these is this whole thing about phraseology and use of some of the semantics by India, and that is where China is coming in. So we'll see how much China sticks, and I think that there will be hard negotiations underway right till the till the end, and you could actually maybe pull a rabbit out of the hat. But if it happens, it'll probably be only at the last minute. And if it doesn't happen, then also I think India will be happy to live with whatever happens, because beyond a point, I don't think India is going to buckle in. And so be it. I mean, that's the way life is. But
I mean, when I look back at Bali, we did help produce a formulation at the end, didn't we?
Yeah, so that is the irony of it, that we played a critical role in Bali. With really doing a lot of the heavy lifting between the Russians and the West to get that whole formulation done. So let's see what happens this time. I mean, it also is a function of the mood on the ground in Ukraine and Europe, in the United States. How much is there any change from Bali in the whole mood towards Russia and Russia's own mood towards the West? So what we are hearing is that the Russians' public position is no compromise. Western position, but the Western, I believe, is divided, actually. There are maybe 2 or 3 countries which are really leading the charge against Russia. And it's not the entire G7 or the Western world at large. And most of the other non-G7 are rather quiet. Saudi, Indonesia, and all these people are maintaining silence. So the fight is actually boiling down to maybe 3, 4, 5 countries.
Do you see India brokering a kind of consensus on climate change, energy? Do you see any breakthrough on these issues?
Look, the only breakthrough is if you say, look, you must implement what you committed in Copenhagen. What you committed in Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Accord of 2009, the Paris Agreement of 2015. The basic issue here is the question of responsibility and financing. And
Yeah.
are you living up to those commitments that you made? That is the real issue. And so finance is there, then you have technology, and then you have, um, energy, other forms of energy cooperation. But it's basically finance and technology at play out here. So here, the worst sufferers are the small island developing states, the most vulnerable. And it is a fact that the finance that was promised, 100 billion a year,
Never did it.
2020 and going up to 2025, has not yet been fully delivered. Now, you also have, apart from G20, this issue is also discussed in parallel in the climate summits. So there also, this issue is discussed. So I don't think I don't think there'll be a major breakthrough on this, but definitely what India will try to do is to obviously put forward its own approach to climate in terms of its own national experience, national models, its own plans for the future. But whether it can swing more money for the developing world, more commitments, I doubt it. Because the fact of the matter actually is that this G20 summit, apart from the wars and everything else, is also taking place at a very difficult time of the global economy, where the advanced economies, the United States and the Eurozone, are in very serious economic difficulty. So the appetite for any major, let's say, impulse or push to kickstart is not there, because if you're growing at 0% or some even negative in Europe, such as Germany, or the United States, maximum 1%. So where is it coming? And now the problem is further compounded with the Chinese growth falling to 4% or 5%. So the overall situation actually is not good at all in terms of the health. We are not in a crisis situation as we were in 2008, obviously, but there are very few silver linings on the clouds. And there, I think India certainly provides that little ray of hope, because of the fact that we are at 6, we could even be 7 or 8. But it's not for us to take on the burden of the whole world. That is
Absolutely.
But yes, I mean, everyone looks for good stories. You don't have a good story in China or in Europe or in the United States in terms of the G20 agenda. So everything, gets affected. Your trade gets affected. Your capital flows get affected. The economies shrink. And then on top of all that, this whole problem of the massive US debt is also affecting the whole global economy and capital flows. So that's how I see it.
The last question. India is pushing for the inclusion of the African Union in the G20. Is this a good move at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's a political move. I mean, if the argument goes that if the European Union can be there, then so should the African Union.
Why not EU?
And why not? And also that if you are really serious about the global economy, then Africa's voice should be heard in the G20. So it's not as if the African continent is a economically significant continent for the global economy, but then again, you have Spain and so on in the G20, which is not exactly also a huge economy. But so it's a good move. I mean, it will again be a legacy issue. It will be a legacy contribution. People will remember, particularly the Africans, that it was India that, it was the Indian presidency which achieved this breakthrough for them. So, yeah, it's good. I mean, we want Africa inside the room. We want their voice heard. But again, over time, the G20 agenda is getting a little diffused over time. It was set up for a certain purpose. It was actually set up, ironically, for the purpose of preserving the capitalist economic world as we knew it at that time. Because what had imploded was not the global economy, but the Western capitalist system. So
Yeah.
it was set up to help, ironically, the G7. They wanted help from the rest of the world. We had nothing to do with it. So the whole thing, all the measures that were taken, emergency measures, the banking reforms, the IMF reforms, oversight, because it was just a collapse all across the financial world and the real world.
Yeah.
So today, of course, we're in a different position. I mean, there is more democratization, if I can use that word. So from that point of view, the African Union presence will be good.
So, any last words on what you would expect from this summit?
Look, I think it's a summit that is taking place in very difficult circumstances, and I think it will take. I mean, India is very well positioned to navigate this very difficult terrain, and what we should see from the summit is if it can in some way contribute to all the difficulties that I mentioned to you, because the fact of the matter is that the external environment for India is today not good. If your biggest export markets are in a slump, if there is no excess capital flowing, if the manufacturing engine locomotive of the world, China, is in difficulty, then, you have problems. So how do you restore confidence? Restoration of confidence is important. And secondly, yes, you can diversify to areas like health and climate and technology and everything else. So if we can, promote some good ideas out of those, and also raise the profile of India or the Indian solution basket to the problems of the world, and put a stamp on the global economic landscape, then we should be happy. But I do not believe we can come up with any one single outcome or radical solution to these problems. I think we should see it more as a process rather than as a one-off. And at the end of the day, I think it's great that we have done this in a really intensive manner. Yeah, in the last 1 year, and this will definitely have a legacy impact for India in many, many ways.
Ambassador Saran, on that note, thank you very much. As always, great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Subir. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. All the best. Bye.
And for those of you who joined us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media and Twitter, X rather. Thank you very much and good night.